It is hard to imagine today, but there was a moment in American history when capitalism didn't just feel unfair, it felt unstable, even suicidal. The country was getting richer faster than any other nation on earth, but that wealth was pooling in the hands of a tiny elite. For everyone else, life was a grind of dangerous work, violent economic crises, and a political system that had been bought, body and soul, by the men who controlled the money. It wasn't just inequality. It was the kind of imbalance that bends a society until it reaches a breaking point. At that time, the idea that the government could do anything about it seemed impossible. The oligarchs were too powerful, the political machine too corrupt, and the system too entrenched. Yet this was the moment when America would attempt something radical, to fix capitalism before capitalism destroyed the country. Welcome to Paper Empire's history. Today we tell the story of how America stepped back from the edge of the abyss, and why we are standing on that same edge again today. To understand how close the country came to breaking, you have to step into the late 1800s, an era of explosive growth and almost zero rules. Railroads stitched the continent together, steel poured into skyscrapers, oil lit the world, and big finance fueled every expansion. This was the birth of a modern economy, but it brought with it a dark twin, the rise of private empires that overshadowed the national one. John D. Rockefeller didn't just dominate the oil market, he dictated its terms. J.P. Morgan didn't just run a bank. He could move the entire economy with a single phone call. Andrew Carnegie and others built systems where competition wasn't something you won, it was something you eliminated. Wealth wasn't just concentrated, it was weaponized. Meanwhile, the working class endured a reality that feels almost dystopian today. 12 to 14-hour shifts were standard. Coal miners inhaled death slowly. Steelworkers died quickly. 8-year-old children were sent into factories not because parents were cruel, but because survival demanded it. There was no job security, no social protection, no minimum wage. If you died on the job, the company simply replaced you. If you protested, they called in private detectives or the army. The political system offered no solution. Senators were effectively for sale, bribed with corporate money or appointed by machines answering to industrial barons. Democracy wasn't dead, but the government had ceased to be a public institution and started to look like a subsidiary of the railroads and banks. And then came the crashes. The Panic of 1873 triggered a deep depression that lasted 6 years. In 1893, hundreds of banks and thousands of businesses evaporated overnight. In the Great Strike of 1877, workers and militias clashed in the cities. These weren't just financial events, they were systemic failures. Americans began to realize that the economy was not merely unfair, it was unstable, fragile, and controlled by private interest, powerful enough to crash the entire system. But here is the forgotten part of the story. The country didn't give up. It didn't accept that inequality was a law of nature or that monopolies were inevitable. Instead, an unlikely coalition, journalists, reformers, unions, and even a few presidents decided to push back. The Gilded Age didn't collapse under its own weight. America confronted it. The first crack in the armor came in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act. On paper, it was simple. Conspiracies restraining trade were illegal. At first, enforcement was impossible, but its significance was monumental. For the first time, the United States declared that the economy was not the private property of a handful of men. It was a public arena, and public arenas have rules. Then came the journalists. Ida Tarbell exposed the ruthless tactics of Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair infiltrated the meat industry and horrified the nation with The Jungle. What drove the change wasn't ideology, it was disgust. When Americans saw what unregulated capitalism looked like behind the curtain, they recoiled collectively. The turning point was Theodore Roosevelt. Energetic and aggressive, Roosevelt understood that a president had to do more than enforce rules. He had to shape the narrative of what a fair economy looked like. When he sued the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad monopoly backed by J.P. Morgan, he wasn't just filing a lawsuit. He was announcing that the era of untouchable private empires was over. Roosevelt didn't hate big business. He hated business so big it threatened the republic. Yet even Roosevelt couldn't prevent the next crisis, the Panic of 1907. When the financial system froze, it wasn't the government that stepped in, it was J.P. Morgan, acting like a one-man central bank. He summoned bankers to his library, locked the doors, and forced them into a rescue plan. It worked, but it terrified the country. No single man should have that much power over the national economy. And so in 1913, the United States created the Federal Reserve. Reforms spread to labor as well. Child labor laws pulled kids out of factories and into schools. Safety standards emerged. The movement for the 8-hour workday began. And with the 16th Amendment, the federal income tax, the government finally had a way to challenge the scale of oligarchic wealth. For a moment, it worked. America didn't dismantle capitalism. It disciplined it. It made the system serve the many instead of revolving around the few. But the story doesn't end here, because history has a habit of circling back. As decades passed, the guardrails that saved the system began to fade. The reforms that disciplined capitalism didn't fail. They were forgotten. And in economic history, forgetting is never neutral. It is a choice. The erosion of rules didn't happen by accident. It happened through lobbying, influence, and the return of an old myth. Markets regulate themselves. Concentrated wealth is efficient. By the late 1970s and early 80s, a new ideology was taking hold, an ideology that viewed regulation as a burden, antitrust as unnecessary, and taxing the rich as an economic mistake. Step by step, decade by decade, the guardrails were pulled back. Finance was deregulated. Mergers expanded without scrutiny. Top tax rates plummeted. Unions collapsed. It didn't happen in a single moment. It happened through thousands of small legislative cuts, each defended as modernization. And today's numbers show the results with uncomfortable clarity. Today, the top 1% of Americans hold nearly 40% of the national wealth. The bottom half holds only 2 to 3%. The top 0.01%, a group small enough to fit in a sports arena, controls wealth comparable to the elites before World War I. In 2023, America's richest 19 households added roughly $1 trillion to their net worth. $1 trillion, divided among fewer than 20 families. If these numbers feel like they are from the 1890s, that's because they are. The architecture of inequality that progressives once dismantled has been rebuilt, now taller, sleeker, more global, and more insulated from democratic pressure. Inequality isn't the only parallel. Look at labor. The Gilded Age was defined by dangerous jobs. Today, no one sends children into coal mines, but the pressures are eerily familiar. Wages have stagnated for decades. Housing and healthcare costs are soaring. Millions of workers drift between precarious jobs with no benefits. Some states are even quietly rolling back child labor protections. Corporate power has also morphed into forms the progressives couldn't have imagined. Standard Oil became big tech. U.S. Steel became global private equity. Railroad trusts turned into digital platforms controlling supply chains and data flows, while old monopolies bought newspapers. New ones algorithmically and invisibly shape information itself. Here we are again. An age of staggering wealth, a fragile workforce, political capture, and rising social frustration. A second Gilded Age, wearing new clothes but running the same playbook. And at this point in the story, it is natural to feel pessimistic. But history doesn't lead us there, because the fundamental lesson of the first progressive era wasn't despair, it was transformation. The pressure of inequality didn't break the country, it changed it. America didn't fix the Gilded Age by luck. It didn't rely on the charity of the rich or the invisible hand correcting itself. Reform happened because ordinary people demanded it. Journalism exposed abuses, and crises forced the country to reckon with the cost of letting private empires grow without limits. None of these forces have disappeared. They are just dormant. The guardrails that once disciplined capitalism still exist in legal codes, case law, and institutional memory. Antitrust is still on the books. Labor protections can be strengthened. Financial regulations can be restored. It is not true that the system is impossible to fix. What is true is that the will to fix it has been inconsistent. History shows that the pendulum always swings back. Societies cannot survive periods of extreme inequality without consequence.
If the Gilded Age taught us anything, it is this. The rules of capitalism are not immutable. They are made by people, shaped by politics, and rewritten when they fail to serve the public. The wealthy have influence, sometimes enormous influence, but the country is larger than any elite group. This was true in 1900, and it is true in 2025. The fact that today's inequality resembles the Gilded Age is not proof that reform is impossible. It is proof that reform is necessary. The very feeling that the system is unbalanced is the signal that a new era of reform is overdue. A century ago, Americans reimagined their economy. They broke up monopolies, protected workers, and built the foundations of the middle class. They did it without perfect unity, but they did it. And the reason they succeeded is the reason we can too, because the rules of the economy are human-made, and what humans make, humans can change. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with intentions. And the last time inequality looked like this, the country didn't fall apart. It fought back. It rewrote the rules. It forced capitalism to serve the many, not the few. This isn't nostalgia. This is precedent.
If what I shared today helped you see the world from a different perspective, don't forget to subscribe, because history always has an answer. You just need to look from the right angle.